It's now the Lawrence A. Tisch Professor of History at Harvard University, Newsweek contributor and author Niall Ferguson out with a new book titled Civilization, the West and the Rest. Neil, good to see you.
Nice to be here with you.
Before we get to the book, let me ask you about Greece. This referendum, the proposed referendum anyway, seemed like a blindside to the rest of Europe. Why is this so important, and what could be the consequences?
Well, the key to understanding this horrible crisis is that the euro is a government-killing machine, and it was going to kill the Papandreou government in Athens at some point, and I think we've probably reached that point now. I'd be quite surprised if he survives even to the end of the week. You know, there's a no-confidence motion he still has to get through this week. But in a sense, it doesn't massively matter, because it kills governments, and then they're replaced by the opposition, and the opposition does exactly the same in terms of policy. That's what we saw in Ireland. It's what we've seen in Portugal. The real problem is that this just adds a new layer of uncertainty. Everybody in Wall Street especially desperately wanted this all to be solved last week, and you had this euphoria rally on Thursday, and I said, give me a break. Nothing's been solved at any level, not the banks, not the sovereign debt, and not the underlying productivity problem. So my sense is that, you know, more trouble ahead, and don't expect this magically to be solved by some kind of Euro summit. It won't be.
So is he doing this vote to save his political hide at the great risk to Europe?
It's a Hail Mary attempt to salvage a situation. I mean, his coalition is crumbling, his government is crumbling, people are defecting from his party. He's got a wafer-thin majority, which may in fact be gone by the end of the week. So I think we're about to say farewell to this government and say hello to a new government that will come in and say, oh dear, we have to keep doing the austerity, because it wouldn't actually make sense for Greece to leave at this point. And I think all this talk about Greece leaves the Eurozone is unrealistic. They'd be wiped out if they did that.
They can't do it. We've got a crew of people in Washington anxious to talk to you. We start with Gene Robinson. Gene.
Yeah, my question is, why is it so unrealistic that Greece would leave the euro, seeing as how, from the standpoint of the average Greek citizen, it looks like I'm facing ruin if we stay. So why not leave and default and let everything crumble out there? But at least we can continue with our Greek way of life.
Well, I think it would be even worse, although it's hard to imagine. But it could be much worse. A great many Greek institutions owe money to non-Greek counterparties in euros, and they couldn't convert those debts into drachma if they brought the drachma back. So I think the difficulty is that you would just blow up your economy. And then the other point is that Greece has a deficit to finance. It keeps having to borrow money. And the markets, I think, would say, forget it, if the Greeks came saying, we've changed our minds, we'd like to borrow in drachma, and they'd only be able to finance their government by printing money. So very quickly you get into a sort of old-style Latin American situation of very, very high inflation. So although things are bad, they're very bad, they've got a kind of depression economy right now in Greece, they're still being offered a significant haircut in terms of their external debt, a 50% reduction, and they're still being offered money, ultimately, from the German taxpayer. I can't see how it would really pay them to withdraw from this system at this point, quite apart from the fact that it's really, really hard to go out of the Eurozone once you're in. So I'm very dubious that this will happen. You'd need something very dramatic, a sort of military coup, and a bunch of economically innumerate generals in charge for it to happen. Don't bet on it.
Professor, this is Michael Steele in Washington. You've got the drama of the Greek meltdown. You've got the euro that's on the rails right now. And sitting very quietly in the cut is this little place called China. And I kind of look at China as sort of the sleeping giant of the 21st century that's looking to make its move. Is that how you're seeing China position itself right now, watching this Western decline, ready to pounce and make its move in such a way that it is the dominant player for the remainder of the century?
Well, Michael, part of the argument of my book Civilization is that we're living through a massive shift in the global balance of economic power and power generally, and it's happening so fast, and it represents such a break with the past that we really struggle to grasp it. I mean, the fact that you call China a sleeping giant is revealing in itself, because believe me, it's not asleep. I spent much of the summer there, and they watch the situation not only in Europe but in the United States with great attention. I was just in London talking with a very senior Chinese economist. The big call for them is whether to step in and help bail Europe out. They love to talk talk about doing this and get everybody excited, but I'd be very surprised if the Chinese sovereign wealth fund risked a significant amount of money on a country like Greece, or for that matter, Portugal. So I think at this point, China is a very wide-awake giant, poised, remember, to become the biggest economy in the world within 5 years, if you believe the International Monetary Fund projections. That's 2016. This is happening extraordinarily fast. You know, when I was a teenager, China was a tiny dwarf in economic terms, and over a period of 30 years, it has raced to the top of the economic league. The US has been the biggest economy in the world since the early 1870s. I don't think we're ready for this transition, and we just hope that the Chinese are asleep on the job. I promise you they're not.
The books.
A quick question on that then. We've basically exhausted sort of the monetary policies that we can do for ourselves, this being the American government, but clearly it's becoming evident that we're basically at the whim of what's happening in the Eurozone, especially our stock market. So if you were advising the administration to pursue any sort of policy path, what would it be?
Well, the administration is in some measure waiting for the deficit super committee to reveal its hand, and I'm not yet clear whether they're going to come up with the goods. The big problem for the United States is to get its fiscal house in order before doubt creeps in about its long-term viability. And at this point, it's an extraordinarily slow and painful process. I wish the United States would get ahead of this game the way the British government did, because it's much better to deal with fiscal imbalances before the bond market loses faith in you. As you see in Greece and other countries in Europe, once you've lost credibility, you're in a death spiral. So that's the big issue for the US. And I suspect we'll finally get there. I always quote Winston Churchill, I do in Civilization. The United States always does the right thing when all the alternatives have been exhausted. I think we've nearly exhausted all the alternatives.
The book is called Civilization, the West and the Rest. We do talk a lot about the decline of America economically, but you also go back and look at the ascendancy of the West, not just the United States, but the West, and the keys to that. Can we recapture some of what led us to have the greatest economy in the world from the 1870s forward?
Yeah, we can. I mean, I'm not a declinist for two reasons. I don't think things in history decline gradually into old age the way you and I sadly will decline. They tend to be fine until they're not fine, and then they collapse, rather in the way that we're seeing Europe collapsing, or the way the dictatorships in North Africa collapsed. But the good news is that we can avert that kind of collapse if we act aggressively to reform our institutions. I use this image of killer applications, which is just a fancy way of saying that the West had these 6 cool institutions that the rest didn't have. And from around 1500, that propelled the West, including North America, into pole position. But when you look at what those institutions were, competition, our mastery of science, the rule of law, our very extraordinary advances in medicine, our consumer society, and our work ethic, on all those different levels, in all those different, if you like, applications, we actually have begun to underperform. So we need to update our software, if I can pursue the analogy further, and reboot the American operating system. I think that's perfectly possible, but it does require us to focus on the things we're no longer doing as well as we used to.
Absolutely. And we need a government that's capable of tackling larger problems.
We sure do.
Than they can right now. The book is Civilization, the West and the Rest. Neil, it's always great to talk to you. Thanks so much.
Thanks.